I hesitate to kind of stay on hard themes, but I think it's really important for a couple of reasons. Last time we spoke, it was in your office and your podcast. And after we wrapped up, we started talking about some people we know and some things that had happened in your community, and kind of spooled into some discussions about things that happened in nearby communities and civilian culture. And, you know, one of the things that's so perplexing, I think, to people, including me, but maybe with time less so, and this actually came up last night in a discussion at home because of some recent events, not close to me, but which is that, you know, some people go through things where there's loss. They go through life and there's hardship. I think most people experience some hardship, certainly some more than others. And every once in a while, and far too often, and even in the SEAL team community, and even in the various communities within the SEAL team community where one would never expect it, right? These are highly trained, tight community, hard guys, right? That's the language we sometimes hear. But as you pointed out, these are people often that have tremendous emotional depth. And I'm so glad that you brought that up, because I think we sometimes think of emotion as weakness. But, you know, there was a time not long ago, 40, 50 years ago, where emotions like jealousy and intensity, think the character Sonny in The Godfather, like he would get so pissed, he would fire his own fist, right? That's a pretty emotional response, where intensity and emotion were kind of interchangeable words, right? At some level. I'm going to be direct. There have been a lot of guys coming out of the SEAL teams I've been surprised to hear that kill themselves. And yesterday there was a major suicide. I didn't know this guy in particular. We actually followed each other on social media, but I admittedly was not close to him, didn't know him at all. In fact, his name was Twitch or something. And he was a public facing figure. But listen, happens all too often. And it even happens in former operators. And suicide's something that fascinates me and intrigues me and scares the hell out of me. Because for the life of me, I cannot map it to any specific thing in the brain or body that we're aware of. And yeah, I've had several friends commit suicide, had my undergrad advisor commit suicide. The point is not them or their story. The point is, what in the world dictates whether or not somebody who has a community, who's doing well and then less well, decides to off themselves, to end their own life, versus, decide, I'm going to keep going. I mean, I'm raising this as a question. I wish I had an answer. I used to have ideas like, it's time perception, where these people are feeling so miserable that they feel it's going to go on forever. But then you start reading the literature on suicide, and I've started to go into this. For those of you that can stomach it, and I don't know that I want to recommend this movie, but I'm just going to say it exists. The movie The Bridge, where they fixed a camera on the Golden Gate Bridge for a year. It turns out one person a day on average tries to jump off. We talked to a guy who survived it. By the way, he jumped off. The moment he went off there, he thought, I wish I hadn't done that. He survived. This kid with bipolar disorder, especially in males, 20 to 30 times higher incidence of suicide. Massive increase. The point is that there's something that happens in the brain where somehow people also will get the idea, and you hear this, that this is like something they're excited to do, or that they're going to right the world somehow by doing this, or that somehow it's like a gift to themselves. Again, I'm not encouraging anybody to do this. I want to be very clear, but these are the things that you hear. And sadly, your community has lost a number of people through suicide. And yet there are a lot of guys that thrive. And so, more as a template for trying to understand mental health and depression and suicide, what are your thoughts on why some people seem to thrive and some people just go all the way down?
Clearly, that's a very complex question, and there's probably a lot of different answers. And I certainly am not one to be able to answer that question. However, probably where my thought has gone on this lately because, you know, I've known some guys that have killed themselves, and I've been totally shocked, and just been completely and totally shocked that guys that I knew killed themselves. Guys that you would think, oh, this guy would never do this in a million years. And that's the feeling I've had about a lot of the guys that I know that have killed themselves. I had a woman on my podcast named Sarah Wilkinson, and she's an awesome woman, and she was married to a SEAL. His name was Chad. I didn't know him. He killed himself. And to hear her describe the story, the shocking thing about the story is that the guy that she knew, and the guy that she married, was not the same guy that killed himself. Something happened to him that made him a different person. And look, they're getting all this information now about CTE and the brain trauma that you go through, and people are exposed to that. And I think, you know, if you've ever seen, you know, George Foreman, he seems totally normal and good to go, right? And Muhammad Ali, not so much. And I've known fighters, and you can look at any number of boxers that have had a career, and some of them are fine, and some of them have some real significant, pugilistic, there's a pugilistic syndrome, right? They've been punched too much and they have problems. So different people, you can expose different people to blast impact, and it's gonna have a different impact over time. And I think that, you know, again, to hear Sarah explain that story and what she saw from her husband and how different he was when they got married compared to where they ended up, it's totally different. A totally different person. I had another friend of mine on who named Marcus Capone, and his wife came on with him, and she said the same thing. Like, the guy that she married was not the same guy that was ready to kill himself, and he didn't, thankfully. It was a different person. And it's not, look, you know, if Fred is married to some woman and Fred and Jessica grow apart over time and he ends up with some other girl, it's still the same guy, right? It's still the same guy that is now, look, they grew apart, they're getting divorced, we get it. But the way that both of them described their husbands as being different people, that's what stuck with me more than anything else. So again, I'm throwing this out there only because it's what I've observed through the people that I know, and seeing and hearing those stories of people being totally different. And I've known a few people. One of my friends, Dave, killed himself. I never would have guessed in a million years that Dave would have killed himself. It doesn't compute. It doesn't compute. And so my suspicion is there has to be something going on mechanically or chemically with the brain that causes them to get into a mode where they're depressed and they don't see a way out, and that's the way they feel now. And again, what's interesting about this is we already talked about the fact that the selection process weeds out guys that are going to take a loss and not be able to get up again. No, you've got SEALs. SEALs can take a loss and get back up again. That's what you learn how to do in bed, or that's what you don't learn how to do. You have it. And if you make it through that training, you have that ability to take a loss. All right, cool, shake it off, get back up, keep going. They're gonna do that to you. So now you've got guys that are taking a loss and they don't see a way out anymore. In fact, to such a point that they're gonna take their own lives. It's, my suspicion is at some point they're going to figure out that this exposure to the adrenaline, the explosions all the time. I mean, you go out to a range, just in peacetime, you go out to a range and you shoot a Carl Gustav, and you're a range safety officer, so you go out there with every guy that's shooting a Carl Gustaf. It's a big, giant, like bazooka-looking weapon, and every time you shoot it, it kind of rattles your cage a little bit. Well, if you're a range safety officer and you're out there and you're going to watch everyone in the platoon shoot 3 of those, it's going to have an impact. Then you go overseas and you're a breacher, or you're part of a breach team. I mean, I had a time where one of my guys, we're doing an assault on a compound. I'm on the ladder. Like most buildings in Iraq have a wall around them. So the way we would conduct these raids, put the ladder up, the breach team would climb over the ladder, and I would go right behind the breach team, and I would stand on the ladder. So I'm looking at the building, observing, making sure there's no one waking up, make sure there's no threats. And then as I'm watching this guy in particular, he puts the breach on the door, explosive breach. So he's going to blow the door up. He's got his little team with him. He puts the breach on the door. He starts to back away, and there's like an obstacle. There was like a freaking table or a lawn chair or something, and he couldn't get around it. And I'm sitting there, it's dark. I mean, it's the middle of the night, it's 2 o'clock in the morning. And I'm like, I wonder what he's going to do. And I see him kind of stuck for a second, and then I just see him lay down. And I'm like, oh, he's just going to take this thing. And sure enough, 3 or 4 feet away from this breach point, he lays down and just clacks off this explosive charge. And I jump over the wall, and as I'm going in, I'm trying to, get the rest of the platoon to go and commence this assault. I look at him. He looked like he just got, hit in the head with a baseball bat. And guess what he did the next night? Another breach on another target. Guess what he did the next night? Another breach on another target. So you get guys that have that exposure, which is, every SEAL is eating a breach. You're eating flashbangs, you're eating breaches, you're shooting 50 cals. Like you're eating some traumatic brain injury. But then you must have some people that have some sort of genetic propensity to have this negative thing happen. And I can only guess, man, that this has something to do with it, because otherwise, we wouldn't be hearing so many of these stories. And of course, we're just talking about the SEAL teams. We're not talking about the military writ large, which is in the same exact boat. I'm also nervous about the social contagion of suicide within the veteran community. I'm nervous about that. It's one of the things that makes me apprehensive about talking about it, but obviously I've talked about it. I've had people on my podcast to discuss these things. But I am worried about that social contagion of, man, Fred did it. He got all this attention and he doesn't have to deal with anything anymore. I'm going to do it too. There's got to be some level of that going on as well. So it's a horrible situation.
Yeah, the social contagion part is one that hits home from a different dimension. The high school I went to, which is, name isn't important, but Gunn High School, G-U-N-N. Gunn High School is famous for being one of the better public high schools. Not that I attended as much as I should have. I can tell you more about the curbs in the parking lot than I could tell you about the classes I took. And that's just not encouraging people to not attend high school. Please do. It took a lot of really hard work to climb back up to where I should have been when I graduated. But it has an infamous reputation, or should I say reputation as an infamous school, because it's one of the highest suicide rates of any of the schools in the country, because there's a train tracks that run through town, and there was a kind of a contagion of kids throwing themselves on the train tracks. This was happening a lot. This was written up in various newspapers, etc. Fortunately, it seems to have died down. Again, I'm also hesitant to talk about this because no one wants to spark this, but there does seem to be something about lack of ability to see into a future, obviously, or the future that people are seeing into is so dark that somehow they lose touch with the idea that emotions come and go. You said it about emotion, about motivation. Emotions come and go, but somehow people lose touch with that. And then I will venture a guess, and here I'm hoping someone's going to figure this out at some point so we can have a more concrete conversation about the mechanisms and what to do about it. But I think there's also something about identity, about loss of a place to put one's energy, something useful in the world. If you're what you're talking about here are guys that are generators, right? They are not projectors. They're generators. They live to have effective action on the world for good, and then end up killing themselves. In youth, it's a little more complicated to put a finger on, because what's going on there. We assume depression, but then in learning more about suicide, there's also this kind of excitement for certain people about solving something that seemed unsolvable any other way. And again, I'm certainly not encouraging this. It strongly discouraging people from taking their own life, obviously. But there's something about time and the loss of perception about time. And